This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
Our speaker tonight, Senator Bob Graham, served in the Florida State Legislature, went on to a two-term governorship in Florida, and then represented Florida as the United States Senator for 18 years, for a total of 38 consecutive years of service to his state and country. A quite exceptional record. Since he officially left office, I like to think of him as the go-to guy. It's pretty clear that whenever there's a really tough problem and people are saying, who should we put on the commission to deal with this problem? Immediately Bob Graham's name comes to the top of the list. And so he's served on a variety of different really important commissions, but most recently on the BP oil spill commission to try to deal with that problem and what should we be doing in the future with respect to drilling in the Gulf and more generally in drilling in waters. And then secondly, he was on the Obama's commission that dealt with financial inquiry after the financial crisis. So that means he's been dealing recently with a lot of issues having to do with oil and money. And that gives us the title of his address tonight, which is Oil and Money. He's also recently co-authored a book, America, the Owner's Manual, Making Government Work for You. And it's a how-to guide for citizens on how to get things done. But tonight, as I said, he's going to talk about oil and money. So my welcome to Senator Bob Graham. Thanks for being here. It's a pleasure. Thanks. It's a pleasure.
Dean, thank you very much for the generous introduction and for the opportunity to be here this evening. I am especially appreciative to be giving this lecture in the name of Michael Nacht, with whom I had the opportunity to spend an hour on Friday getting scared about what is about to happen. And let me say, if you have some aversion to fear, you might want to leave and I will not be offended, because this ain't going to be a very happy presentation that I am going to make. I feel in a way this is a payback. I was elected to the Florida legislature in 1966, and by good fortune and some friendships, became the chairman of the House Committee on Appropriations for Higher Education. That led me to spend the next 4 years trying to understand higher education. And in the course of that, I visited California on a couple of occasions and at least established a relationship with Clark Kerr. I asked Dr. Kerr at one point, it took Harvard the better part of 3 centuries to be thought of as competitive with Cambridge and Oxford. It took the University of California just a generation to move to the front ranks of state universities and competitive with the Harvards of the East. How did that happen? What was the chemistry that allowed such a rapid enhancement? Dr. Kerr's answer was that for a generation, the people of California identified their future and the future of their children with the University of California, particularly this campus. That was the fact that I can recall it now over 40 years ago is illustrative of how significant those remarks were. And I envy California for its ability to do that. I have tried to instill some of that same recognition of the linkage for the people of Florida, and I'm afraid both states now are struggling during this difficult economic time to maintain the progress that we have made in higher education. The dean has already said that although I am actually out of work and employed and looking for something to do, that I have had a few opportunities recently to go back to school on some very important and interesting issues. I'm going to talk primarily about the two most recent of my assignments, which will be the oil spill and the financial crisis, and I will hold to the end some discussion of the other, which is weapons of mass destruction and proliferation thereof. And it really gets scary at that point. Let me start with a brief summary of these two crises, beginning with the financial crisis. The 1990s were good times for America. We had assimilated or would assimilate crises such as the Latin American and Asian financial crises and the dot-com bust. The world was awash in money and saw the United States as the safest place to put it. In the United States, the last 2 years of the 1990s, we actually ran, for the first time since Lyndon Johnson's administration, a surplus in the federal treasury. The United States, many prominent economists declared that we had learned the lesson of the Depression and that we were free from the threat that we might have another economic crisis. Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, said that markets are self-regulating and the role of government is to basically stay out of the way. But there were a few nagging problems as we got into the first decade of the 21st century. One of those was an increasing gap in income. We'd reached the point where the top 5% of Americans controlled about 66% of all the wealth in the country, and the bottom 80% of Americans controlled 13% of the wealth. We had not known such disparities in income since a rather ominous year, 1929. At the level of the middle-class working American family, they had seen a decade of stagnation in real income growth. There were some increasingly darker clouds. Price of housing was rapidly increasing. It led to the belief that your home was your ATM machine. In 2005, there were more home mortgages granted to refinance an existing home, to take equity out of a house you already own, than mortgages for new homes. The mortgage market was the initial starting point of the contagion that has led to the current recession. Lending standards began to collapse. A word that in the past would have been thought of as pejorative, liar's loan, became the expectation that people weren't really expected to put down on their application what their real capacity was, because everybody knew that the house would be worth 10 or 15 or 20% more a year from now, and therefore whatever their ability to pay, there was going to be sufficient equity to cover it. There were new financial instruments being developed, things like synthetic collateralized debt obligations, which were expanding the customer base for mortgages to a global market. It's interesting that some of the first signs of our mortgage crisis showed up in German banks who had purchased a lot of these very sophisticated documents, and we're seeing them begin to go south. The regulators noted the fact that there was an overheated housing market, but chose not to do anything about it. And then tragedy struck. It was a three-tiered tragedy, starting from mortgages, which in the summer of 2006, housing prices began to decline, and a larger and larger number of Americans fell into foreclosure. There are some regions in my state where 1 out of every 7 homes is in some stage of foreclosure. The foreclosures were also, or the documents that backed up those weak mortgages, on the balance sheets of some of our largest banks. And so what had started out as a housing mortgage financial crisis became a general financial crisis, as some of the most significant institutions in America, many of which had engaged in lending practices which were at levels of 30 to 40 to 1 leverage, they fell into difficulty. And their response was largely self-protective. They hoarded money, including the money that the federal government would give them shortly thereafter as part of the TARP program, and they used it to rebuild their own balance sheets, and in some cases to finance mergers, think Wachovia and Wells Fargo, and were not lending into the general economy, and that's thus causing the third tier, which was a general economic collapse, the worst collapse that America had experienced since the 1930s. Well, does that make you feel uplifted and inspired? Now let's turn to the second tragedy, the oil spill. The United States has been involved in offshore oil drilling for most of the 20th century. In fact, the first drilling was done off Santa Barbara here in California. But by the end of World War II, the focus of attention had shifted to the Gulf. The Gulf was found to be a series of rich deposits, relatively easily accessible. The first was drilled in 1938. Then there was a cessation during World War II, but it came back with abandon after World War II, when there have been some 44,000 drilling sites in shallow waters in the Gulf of Mexico. Shallow waters being defined as 1,000 feet or less. Those were relatively easy to do, safe. They'd been done multiple times. It was considered to be almost a no-risk business. And out of that, and out of the culture of the wildcatter, the fellow who used to go out with little money, a few tools, but a lot of optimism, and to find an oil field, that attitude transferred to the Gulf and created what is referred to as the culture of complacency as it relates to safety. Those good times were reinforced by the fact that oil prices were steadily climbing. In 1991, a barrel of oil could be bought for less than $20. Today, as we know, it's over $100. There was an increasing sophistication in the industry. The industry used to be very hierarchical. That is, the same company controlled virtually every step of the process. As the industry began to move into deeper and deeper waters and more complex circumstances, it became more of an outsourced operation. As an example, every oil company, or at least every major oil company, used to have its own capability to test cement. And I'll mention in a few moments why that's so important. Today, only one company, Chevron, has retained that. All the other big companies have outsourced that largely to one company, Halliburton. Today, we've become increasingly dependent on that offshore drilling. About 1/3 of our domestic oil today comes from an offshore site, primarily in the Gulf of Mexico, and that percentage is rapidly growing. So in the 1990s and the first decade of the 21st century, life was good in the oil patch. Then disaster struck. April 20th, 2010, the largest man-made environmental disaster in the nation's history occurred at a drilling site 50 miles south of New Orleans called the Macondo. Macondo was being drilled by BP. BP is one of the 6 largest oil companies in the world, but it is the outlier. It has been known within the industry as the firm with the weakest safety regimens. There was a site that was up for lease. It was one of the riskiest sites in the Gulf of Mexico. It's called the Mississippi Trench. It was going to require drilling at up to 20,000 feet. It was enormous pressure, 17,000 pounds per square inch of pressure at the bottom of the Mississippi Trench, a very unstable geology. Well, because we had a leasing policy that basically said the most important thing is how can we optimize royalties, and since BP bid the highest royalty on that site, we ended up with the company with the worst safety record about to start drilling in one of the most dangerous areas of the Gulf. The problem started early. In 2009, when they began drilling, they immediately ran into a series of problems, causing a delay by the fall of 2009 of over 45 days. Because of that delay, they were into the hurricane season, which they had hoped to avoid. And in fact, a hurricane hit their drilling rig and damaged it so much that it had to be sent back for major repairs. BP found another rig, which was a new rig, and many cases, many instances, was the queen of the offshore oil rig fleet, called Deepwater Horizon. The only area of which I'm familiar that I would say is comparable in its technical sophistication to that drilling rig would be the space program, and in many ways they have great similarities. The Deepwater Horizon had a problem, and that was since it was not expected that BP was going to be using it for this Macondo well, the owner, Transocean, a Swiss multinational company, had already signed a commitment for the Deepwater Horizon to go to another site beginning in May of 2010. So they were under a lot of pressure to get this completed before that new commitment would take place. In the hours before 9 p.m. on April 20th, there were a series of mistakes made at Macondo, and almost every one of those mistakes was related to the pressure of time to get this thing completed. As an example, I mentioned cement. Before I got involved in this, I didn't really appreciate the role that cement played in drilling for oil. But it is one of the most important and one of the last actions taken when the drill rig has reached its depth, which in the case of Macondo is a little over 18,000 feet. They then pour a massive amount of cement down the pipe, which goes up around the outside of the pipe and seals the pipe from these enormous pressures. Without that, the pressures have the potential of crushing the pipe and allowing particularly the natural gas to get into the pipe. The cement contractor was Halliburton, the largest such contractor in the world. Halliburton had there is a separate recipe for cement for each site based on its depth, the geological conditions, pressure. So they had a special recipe for Macondo. They tested in the laboratory twice. It failed twice. Before they could test it a third time, they poured it down the pipe on April the 20th, 2010. And the cement failed again, allowing gas to get into the pipe. The gas rose and led to an explosion which killed 11 people and wounded several dozens and caused an economic calamity, the full cost of which we will not know for some time, and an environmental disaster which will probably be decades before we have a full accounting. After the explosion, we then got into the second phase, the response. Each company is required to submit a response plan of what they will do in the event of an accident and an indication that they have the capability of executing that plan. What we quickly found out was that the response plans were Xeroxed. In fact, the one from a condo 50 miles south of New Orleans talked about what they would do to respond to the issues of walruses and sea lions, the likes of which have seldom been seen in the Gulf of Mexico. And their representations as to containment capability proved to be totally fictitious. There was a stumbling around for the first 30 days. Part of that stumbling around was the inability to answer a basic question. How much is coming out of this pipe? BP originally said, we think it's about 1,000 gallons a day. That was adjusted to 6,000 gallons a day when they were attempting to put various containers on top of this pipe. Finally, it was determined, and in fact, a former faculty member here was the key person in this, Secretary Chu of the Department of Energy, that it was 62,000 gallons a day. And therefore, all of these early efforts were doomed to failure because they were so out of scale with the severity of the problem. Finally, with the good work of people like Dr. Chu and many scientists from our national laboratories, it was possible to put a cap, and some 100 days after the event, it was finally brought under control. As I served on these two commissions, and we frequently were meeting almost simultaneously, it became clear to me that there were some important similarities between oil and money. One of those is that both of these events, the financial crisis and the oil spill, were avoidable. These were not acts of nature. They were not the normal business cycle recurring. They were events that were man-made failures. Second, that it was a case in which the offense had overrun the defense. In the case of oil, they'd been drilling for a long time in shallow waters, and there was an assumption that if we can develop the technology, we can move seamlessly into these deeper waters. And there was a tremendous incentive to do that. The typical shallow water well produces about 500 barrels of oil a day. Some of these fields that are now being found in deep water, and this is not a partisan label, this is the industry label, that are referred to as elephants. And some of those elephants will produce 100,000 barrels of oil a day. That's why the search for them is so intense. And that search has developed the technology on the offense, but not the equivalent technology to deal with safety or response to safety lapses. In much the same way on money. The financial industry had developed extremely sophisticated mathematical models for their investment practices. I'm going to say something that may bring down the wrath of these students because they already have been on my case earlier. I spent a year at the Kennedy School from 2005 to 2006 and lived in the dormitory, so got to spend a lot of time with students. And what surprised me when I talked to students who were majoring in mathematics, and I asked them what they were going to do, expecting that they were going to go into some high level of industrial or technological applications. Almost without exception, that was not the case. They were going to go to work for Goldman Sachs and apply their mathematical skills to develop the next generation of sophisticated instruments. At the same time, the regulatory systems were still based on the model of the 1930s and were very ponderous and demonstrably inadequate. There were also warning signs. In the case of money, the overheated housing market, particularly in what are referred to as the SANDS, S-A-N-D-S states, which are California, Arizona, Nevada, and Florida. Those were the 4 states that were most affected by this out-of-control housing market. And in the case of the oil spill, there had been an oil spill in Australia 8 months before Macondo. It was called the Montara. And guess why the Montara off the northwest coast of Australia exploded? The cement. The same cause, and guess who the cement contractor was on the Montara? Halliburton. But you know, when you ask the people at BP, were you aware that just 8 months ago, on a well similar to the one you're drilling in the Gulf, that there was a cement failure which led to the greatest offshore disaster in Australia's oil production history? They were totally ignorant of that. So the warning signs were either unknown or ignored. There was also an attitude that it can't happen here. Economists were saying we couldn't have another recession. The people in the oil industry said we've dug 44,000 of these wells without a problem. What are you talking about that we may need to increase our safety standards? We're safe enough. There was also a disconnect between the party who was causing the problem and the party who was going to feel the consequences. In the case of money, typically the mortgages started with a mortgage broker. That mortgage broker was compensated based on a commission, based on how big the mortgage was and how many mortgages he or she could generate. As soon as he generated one of these poor mortgages, they would then sell it to a second party, who would sell it to a third party, and finally it ends up on the books of a German bank. And that's where the consequences were. One of the basic principles of capitalism, that risk and reward are merged in the same person, so that if you make a bad decision, you feel the consequences of it, were being avoided. And the same thing was true in the oil industry, where because of this change in the nature of the industry from hierarchical to highly outsourced, there was a division. Going back to that Montara, the inquiry that was done into the Montara event in Australia, and I met in February with the people who are the equivalent of our Department of Interior, under Australian law, which puts all the responsibility on the permittee, which was an oil company from Thailand, Halliburton, although it was the principal responsible party, had no consequences as a result of that event. And finally, there was too cozy a relationship, both in money and oil, between the industry and their supposed regulators. In the case of oil, it is an X-rated story of how close, and I mean that in the literal sense, the industry and the regulators became. And in the case of the of money, there was no comparable increase in the capabilities of the oversight regulators, whether they were the Federal Reserve Board, the SEC, the controller of the currency, or whoever was responsible, and the size and complexity of what they were supposed to be regulating. The question that we would ask is, will we learn the lessons of these two tragedies? Will we take them on board, so to speak, and use these as the impetus for reform? You may have heard the President's speech last week talking about energy policy, where some people had questioned, why do we need to consider a new energy policy in America? And the President said, has everybody acquired amnesia? Does nobody remember April the 20th, less than a year ago? Have you forgotten the lessons that we should have learned from that incident? Unfortunately, for many people, the answer was, we did forget. There are some good examples of industries that did learn the lesson. After Bhopal in India, the chemical industry and its regulators, the Chemical Safety Board, became much more safety-oriented. In the case of the nuclear power industry, after 3 Mile Island, the industry set up a group called INPO, which is a self-policing safety institute, which is independent from, but has the same basic objective as the governmental regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to elevate the standards of safety in America's nuclear plants. Will our financial institutions, will our oil companies be like chemical and nuclear, that they'll learn from these lessons? Well, I'll have to say that the record thus far is not very impressive. In the case of the oil industry, you may have seen just within the last 3 days, Transocean, one of the 3 culpable parties in Macondo, issued a proxy statement to its shareholders saying 2010 is the best safety year this company has ever had, and therefore we will give bonuses to our executives based on our safety performance. Here's a company that was culpable in killing 11 people, wounding many more, and causing enormous economic and environmental damage. I would have to say that the best you could say is that they had a 10 ear towards what was really happening. In the case of the industry, we'd urge that they establish, as the nuclear industry had, an internal capability to achieve a high standard of safety. There is no reason why the United States should not be the world leader in safety of its offshore oil enterprise. Bob B., who is a professor in the engineering school here and probably one of the most renowned academics in this area, uses the phrase, "We are watching other countries' rear lights in terms of safety," with particularly the Norwegians, the British, and the Australians being significantly ahead of us. Let me just, it's test time now. One of the things we found out was there's very little comparability in accident reporting in the global oil industry. So you read the number of accidents, for instance, that have occurred in the North Sea, and you read the number that have occurred in the Gulf, and you would say, boy, the Gulf must really be doing the job on safety because they have so many fewer accidents. Well, what we found out is it wasn't that we were having fewer accidents, we were having fewer reported accidents. Now, the one area where you can't fudge very much is in fatalities. I mean, there is a dead body somewhere. You can count those. What do you think the relationship? Some of you may have been on the coast of Scotland or Norway and experienced the North Sea. It's a pretty bitter environment. The Gulf of Mexico, except for hurricanes, is a fairly benign environment. What do you think the ratio of fatalities per 100 million hours worked is between the North Sea and the Gulf of Mexico? Well, the answer is it's 5 to 1, not on our side. 5 persons killed in the Gulf for every 1 person killed in the North Sea. That is an outrageous and totally unacceptable statistic. And yet the industry has refused to date to set up a comparable operation to that which nuclear power has done. And in terms of Congress, Congress is driven by the phrase, drill, baby, drill. And the most significant legislation that has a chance of passage has been introduced will actually contribute to less safety by reducing the time that the regulators have to review permits and determine if, for instance, the response plan is reasonable and if the company has the capability to carry out the response plan. So I would say that it's been a rather disappointing effort thus far as it relates to oil, and it's not much better as it relates to money. There was the Dodd-Frank bill, which passed the Congress about 18 months ago, which was an important piece of legislation, generally ascribed to be the most significant financial reform since the 1930s. But already it's being picked apart, particularly in the House of Representatives, by threats to cut the funding of the institutions such as the Federal Reserve, which are supposed to be carrying out these new standards. So have we learned the lesson? Not very evident thus far. What are some of the policy implications of this? I would say there are primarily three. One is an obvious one, and that is that we have not repealed human nature. The Greeks had it right. Their philosophers identified that human beings have certain inherent weaknesses: greed, avarice, arrogance are just a few of those negative qualities. And the Greeks said that one of the reasons that we have government is to constrain those negative factors. Well, friends, what was true in Athens 23 or 400 years ago is true in Houston and on Wall Street today. Those same characteristics are present, but we have not had an effective governmental capability to rein them in. Second is the need for anticipatory and nimble forms of that regulation, not the let's let the disaster occur first and then try to figure out what we're going to do about it. Today we tend to have a regulatory system which is based on a problem has happened and we're going to not let that problem occur again. And I'm now going to give you another test. You didn't do very well on the North Sea and the Gulf, but this is redemption time. I was elected to the United States Senate in 1986, sworn in January of '87. A few days after I was sworn in, a representative from the Secretary of the Senate's office comes to tell me about all the stuff that I'm going to be provided. I might say this is 1987. I will not give you this question, but I'll just give you the answer. A senator in the fourth largest state and the senator in the largest state, California, got exactly the same number of computers for their staff to deal with all of the constituent and other issues they have. And you know what that number was? 3. That's how much in the vanguard of modern technology the United States Senate was. But we were in the vanguard in terms of controlling one serious vice that had been uncovered. The man from the Secretary of the Senate's office told me that I was going to have to sign a piece of paper assuming personal responsibility for one item and one item only in my office, and if it wasn't there when I left or if it was damaged, I would have to pay the federal government for the cost. What do you think that one item was? Desk, chair, no. Fax machine, no. No. Water cooler, no. That would have been a good one. Well, you have the key to the men's room or ladies' room, no. Well, you failed again. I'm very disappointed. The answer is the dictionary. And it was a very nice, big Oxford dictionary. I'm certain that in 1843, some senator who had probably lost his re-election decided to put the dictionary in his bag and go home with it. And then they decided, by God, we're never going to let this happen again, so we're going to require each member of the Senate to take personal responsibility for the dictionary. And I would say, boy, when that dictionary was returned after my 18 years, it was in very good shape. But that is typical of regulation. It sees a problem, and the solution is to that specific problem. It happened again in 1990. We had the largest oil spill prior to Macondo called Exxon Valdez. A vessel containing oil went aground in an interior water body in Alaska. In 1990, the Congress passed the Oil Spill Prevention Act, which was based specifically on a tanker going aground in an inland water body. That was the law of America. It is the law of America today. Therefore, was the controlling law when Macondo occurred. People suddenly realized that the industry had changed dramatically, and it wasn't potentially leaking ships that were our big problem. It was potentially leaking wells 18,000 feet below the surface that were our problem. So a second lesson is we need to reform our regulatory system to be more nimble and anticipatory towards rapidly changing events. Some of the things that have been suggested, and let me say I'm dwelling on this because this is a public policy school, and therefore you're obligated to talk about public policy, right? One approach is what's referred to as sunsets, where you pass a law like that 1990 law and say it'll go out of existence in 1995 unless it's reenacted. The theory of that is it forces people to consider what changes have occurred and what's appropriate for the future. The problem today is I'm worried that what would happen if it came up 5 years later would be, instead of using 5 years of new information to make the law better, there would be an effort, as is happening today, to make the law weaker in response to the urging of the affected industry. Another approach is a mandatory review. I was chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. We had a legal requirement every year to hold a hearing with the heads of the intelligence agencies, both in closed session and in public session, on what were the threats that America was facing in this next upcoming year, and what did that mean for our intelligence community. That may have some useful application. There used to be in Congress a Congressional Office of Science and Technology, and it was to be the place that Congress would turn if it had a difficult science-based problem. Unfortunately, when a soon-to-be presidential candidate became Speaker of the House of Representatives in 1994, I'm not going to name who that person was, they abolished the Congressional Office of Science and Technology. So now, if you were a member of Congress and you wanted to ask the question, what should we be doing to more appropriately regulate our offshore oil industry or our financial industry, to the extent that it involved a science or technical answer, you wouldn't have a place to get it. So those are some of the public policy issues and potential responses. I mentioned that I was going to withhold the issue of weapons of mass destruction until later. Well, later is now. The one thing that most distinguishes the WMD problem from oil and money is it hasn't happened. We've had a financial crisis. We've had an environmental disaster with great human toll. What we haven't had is a terrorist using a weapon of mass destruction. The Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission that I chaired in 2008 and 2009, which contained some of the most eminent people in the country on that subject, came to 3 judgments. One was that we were becoming less safe against a terrorist use of a WMD. And that was based on a number of factors, including that access, particularly on the biological side, was so much easier today than it had been in the past, and that the terrorist organizations, particularly Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda, had gained more capabilities to use them. Second, we found that it was better than a 50-50 prospect that there will be a weapon of mass destruction used by a terrorist someplace on Earth before the end of the year 2013. And third, that it was more likely that that would be a biological rather than a nuclear device. The question is, will we wait until we have yet another disaster before we take the steps that are available to us now to reduce that percentage, at least to make the United States the part of the world that is the least vulnerable to a weapon of mass destruction attack? So the question now before us, friends, is we have had the tragedy of money, we've had the tragedy of oil. Are we going to have to relive those tragedies with a tragedy of a weapon of mass destruction? I hope that we'll be wise enough to avoid that. Thank you.
Please come over and sit down. We're going to open up some water here for you. That was wonderful. We have some great questions here from the audience. I may be able to get a few more in, although I've got a lot up here. Let me start with one which I think is on everybody's mind. And this questioner asks, have you seen the Academy Award-winning film Inside Job? Is it, to your knowledge, accurate? But the question goes on. If so, will we ever see prosecutions of the wrongdoers? How about the wrongdoers in the Gulf oil spill? And another person asks a related question, and very directly, why are people from the financial industry and people from BP and Halliburton not in jail? So let's do the not in jail first and then maybe ask whether Inside Job got it right.
I have not seen the movie Inside Job, but I'm familiar with what its thesis is. I think it's an outrage. During the S&L crisis of the late 80s and early 90s, there were scores of people who went to jail. The most prominent savings and loan executive in Miami spent 7 or 8 years in jail because of his actions. As of today, the only person that are being sent to jail are the victims. You may have seen the New York Times article recently about the young man from West Virginia. Yes, he signed a liar's loan, but the person who took the liar's loan was a sophisticated mortgage broker who has gone scot-free. I don't think we're sending a very effective signal of deterrence that this kind of behavior is unacceptable. As to the oil spill, the Department of Justice has opened a criminal investigation, and it potentially could lead to some indictments, but the jury has not yet been sworn in, much less rendered a verdict on that.
Inside Job makes the point that some of the advisors to President Obama are the same people who were around during the genesis of the financial crisis. Tim Geithner, Larry Summers. Summers has now left, but he was certainly there for the beginning of the administration. Is that a problem? Is that something we should be worried about, that there's just too cozy a relationship here?
Yeah. I think most of the things that have gotten President Obama in trouble, and let me say I am a strong supporter and am privileged to have been able to serve in the positions that he has offered to me. But I think most of his problems today are the result of the first 60 days beginning with the transition and then into the early weeks of his presidency. One of those was he had run for office, as all politicians do, making certain commitments based on the state of the world at the time the campaign's being conducted. One of his principal commitments was health care reform, and I think we'd all agree that that is an issue that demands attention. The problem was the world shifted between October of 2008 and the time President Obama took the office, and the issue for Americans in January of 2009 was not health care, it was the state of the economy. And I think the president would have been well served if he would have given a speech basically saying, I am serious and faithful to the commitments that I made as a candidate, and over my term in office will strive to achieve those important goals. But right now we have a fire in our nation's house that's got to be attended to, and it is to that fire that I'm going to direct all of my attention. And to be the fire personnel, I'm going to bring in some new people with some new thoughts and ideas of how to deal with this contagion, and not be seen as importing the people who, in many instances, made key decisions that contributed to the very problem. I think the president is a good man. He, as frequently happens, stumbled right out of the gate and is still striving to recover his balance. I hope he does so between now and November 2012, because the options are pretty scary.
This is sort of a related question. There's a book, as you know, about the Enron scandal called The Smartest People in the Room. And the questionnaire asks, how can we get the smartest people in the room working on defense rather than offense? And I think it gets back to this question of advisors. I mean, one of the reasons you could excuse Obama is you could say, well, you had to have people who really understood the situation, and Larry Summers understood the situation, and Geithner understood the situation. So he was just getting some people who understood it. But the problem is they were implicated in the creation of the problem. And so how do you overcome that problem? And especially for a public policy school like ours, how do we make sure that folks from public policy schools who really do want to work on defense at least part of the time, that they get a chance to really do that?
I will about to irritate what little support I have in this audience by saying that there's an old saying in the military that the generals are always fighting the last wars. I think there's some similarity to academics. I believe one of the problems we had is we had too many academics and economists in positions of major policy who had spent too much time understanding the Great Depression. And I would put Mr. Bernanke as the chairman of the Fed at the top of that list. It's a good thing for people to study and understand the past. It's not a good thing to assume that the present is a replication of the past. The fact is, the world in the second decade of the 21st century is a lot different place than it was in the 1930s, and therefore fresh thinking and fresh analysis and prescriptions are called for. As to how we can better balance the defense with the offense, I think it starts within the industry. It has to have a commitment to safe and appropriate actions, high standard of ethics. It then moves to the regulatory community, which has to have people of equal technical knowledge and competence and self-confidence to those that are being regulated in order to assure that proper defensive measures are being taken. And I think the intellectual community has a major role here, because you're going to be providing the ideas and fresh content that should shape the new policy directions to deal with the new conditions in which those policies are going to be applied.
So my final question goes in a different direction, and it's really trying to get at what can we do to get young people energized. And this person asks, should we have a National Youth Energy Efficiency Corps as an alternative to military service, or just even as a way that young people can get involved in trying to deal with the questions of energy efficiency?
That might be an idea, but I think the problem is much more fundamental than that. I graduated from high school in 1955. When I graduated, I had taken 3 one-year courses in civics from the 7th to the 12th grade. And I was not an outlier. That was the national standard. My oldest granddaughter graduated from a public high school in Tallahassee, Florida in 2009. She had also taken the national standard of civics. That was one semester. We have, for 2 generations, we have given our young people the equivalent of 450 days less structured instruction about what it means to be a citizen in our democracy. They didn't take a course like Problems in Democracy, where you learned concepts such as reasoned compromise. They didn't take a course, as I did in the 12th grade, on the role of the citizen in democracy, where we learned the skills of being an effective participating citizen. While I would not put all of the blame for the current state of our democracy on that, I would put the principal share on the fact that we have given up educating our young people, and now our not so young people are carrying that deficit with them. And therefore we have a population that doesn't understand how democracy works, a population which increasingly is unwilling to be personally involved. And I commend those of you who are here tonight, because your very presence indicates your desire to be actively involved. And maybe the metaphor for this I saw in the Dulles airport, where there is a kiosk from which you can buy political memorabilia. In that kiosk, I saw a T-shirt, and the T-shirt had across the top, "I love America." In the middle, it had, "I hate its government." Well, when I say the Pledge of Allegiance, I think it says that the flag stands for the Republic. So how can you love America, the flag and all of its symbols, and hate the very thing for which those symbols represent? So I think we've got a major challenge. One of the things that I'm spending a lot of my time on is a center at the University of Florida devoted to citizenship. Citizenship at the university itself and influencing citizenship throughout the state, beginning with that next generation that I hope will not go through the same shredding of exposure to citizenship that has happened to now 40 years of young Americans.
And I would have to say that's why the Goldman School of Public Policy is so proud of what it does, because we're trying to make government better so that we can make America better, and so that we can have a country that really performs well and solves problems, especially some of these really tough problems that you've talked to us about tonight, problems of oil and money. And I want to thank Senator Bob Graham for being with us here tonight. And say that he's a public servant who epitomizes what we need more of in Washington and in the world to help really focus on, understand, and solve problems. So thank you so very much.